Hi, everyone. Welcome to Responsible Innovation 100. Here, we learn from leading responsible innovators about how they are working towards a better 2050. We are very fortunate to have Liselott Ingestam with us today, all the way from Sweden. She is a founder of Digoshan and is on the board of a number of tech companies. So today, Liselott will be speaking with us about responsible innovation from a board perspective. So a big welcome to Liselott. How's your week been? And tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm based in Sweden, and since we are often misunderstood to be Swiss, I'll let you know that we're in the northern part of Europe, not in the middle part. I do work as a professional board member. I work on 4 listed companies and 2 private companies. And they're all in some version of digital, trying to make things more sustainable, but still having their core business. And the think tank that I've started 7 years back, I think, we engage in research, in academic research. We engage in training of board members and chairs, and I also host board networks on that, and I'm trying to go to modern governance. And finally, I also invest in startups, and I'm a member of a VC company, so I also coach startups.
Wow, okay. That's actually a very good way to lead into my first question. You are on a number of boards. Actually, you just joined a new board earlier this month. So what's the usual process of actually getting a position on a board?
So I would say the most usual way is that you know somebody that knows something about you. So it's basically the networks. Maybe that isn't fully true when you get later in the process, but the first number of board networks is certainly like that. And one of the things that I recommend to anybody who wants to be on boards is think about 2 things. Think about somewhere you actually can add value, but also think about that the business should preferably be smaller than the business you have run, because then you're quite sure that you can add value.
Right.
And now I'm not going all the way down to startups, because I think startups is a particular breed, and it's also a particular breed of board work. But for the others, it's very much through networks, the first number of board positions. And then it's basically through rumors in the in the arena. And you have to be known, right? So that's how you get them.
So once you get on board, what's the first thing that you think about? What do you look for?
You actually start looking for that already when you're being asked to join the board, because you have your own little due diligence in order to actually join the board. You try your most to understand what business are they in, what are the competitors, what do their customers say. You try to listen on social media. If you're on a bit bigger companies, one of the things I do is I go into Glassdoor.
Oh, yeah.
And I see what the employees are saying.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to do a number of things to get a feeling for the company and get to know the company. In all of my cases, I understand the business model. So I understand kind of things they're trying to sell and offer and deliver to the customers. Then one of the things that you have to hold back is to look too much to the strategy and have a lot of opinions early on the strategy. Because if you think clearly about it, the strategy they have is the strategy that everybody else on the board before you have done. So if you're too critical, it might be right, it might be wrong, because you don't have all of the facts, but it's super bad to do it to alienate all of the other board members. So try to understand, ask a lot of clarifying questions. So the thing you would be looking for is, how does the CEO, how does the management team, how do they present, how do they appear when you discuss with them, and also the same with the board team in itself. How do they collaborate, and how open are they for questions and how does that work? You start really very high up and very soft before you start to go into the more critical things.
Right. Because you got so much experience with so many different companies, what do you see is the most critical change and transformation in the area of board leadership?
I think the most critical thing is that most boards were designed for a slower time. So it was designed for a time when change was not as fast or disruptive, which meant that you can take out your 3 or 5 year strategy, you just refine it in the years between. And you were very much also in the last years in a growth world and also in a very global collaborating world. Now, a couple of things have happened since. I mean, obviously, the pandemic has impacted a lot of the things that the companies does, but also how the board works, because the board has to work primarily just over digital. The main thing around the thinking and the trends that comes into the board is now that you have to look at a lot of geopolitical trends, a lot of trying to understand what are some of the worst things that can happen. I think we were more on the growth horizon before. Now we need to look at the flexibility horizon a bit more. And of course, if you're on the board, in most cases, you will have had your fair share of cyber attacks and ransomware, and that goes directly to the board. That is another kind of illustration of a topic that most people anywhere, not just in the boards, actually don't really understand. How can it happen? How do you make sure? Can you ever be 100% protected? How much would 100% protection cost? How well protected are we? So all of these questions are things you will have to start to deal with without having previous things to look at.
Right.
If you work on a large company, there's tons of incidents all the time, right? I mean, things happen. Customers get angry, partners go in bankruptcy, a lot of things happen. Not everything comes directly to the board. I mean, it comes to the board eventually. But when you're hacked, then the board come together very quickly because the threat to the company is so significant. So you need to be able to think through what are you going to do? And the worst discussion and thoughts are, I mean, if I go with the cyber area, it's around if the company is fully down and we can't get it up, will we pay the ransomware or not? And I think it's very easy to sit when you are not in the situation and say, of course, we will never pay. But everything has a price, right? I mean, if you're going to put the company to death, it does have a price. I think the other area that has been really, really tough for many companies now, and that has been moral types of issues. So I have businesses in both Ukraine and Russia. So we have had to take decisions around what do we do? How do we support the different units? Do we stay in Russia? You have to take it without having all of the information available. And there are things that wasn't known before. So you have to go back to a lot of integrity and a lot of debate on that.
When we spoke last time, you spoke about transformational boards versus a traditional board.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in knowing the difference between the two.
Well, since I spent 4 years doing research on it, I have a very specific answer to that question. But I would say transformational boards do 3 things, a bit better or a bit quicker. And the first thing is that they sense better. So they have their own mechanisms to pick up insights from the surroundings or from market trends or basically also outside of the company, not just what the company tells them goes on in the market. So that's one thing. The second thing is they're better at doing the pivot. So they're better at actually making sense of all of these things coming in and taking it in and deciding, what are we going to do? And do we have to redo an entire strategy? And how quickly do we need to do that and act on that? So figuring out how impactful are all of these things going to be, and how quickly do we need to act? And what do we need to do? What is our new value creation going to be? And the third thing would be around aligning the company and the resources to that, and do that quickly enough. I can probably take an example for people to realize that a good board really moves resources towards the true value creation opportunities. It's very easy to get stuck and say you have these 5 divisions and you ask everybody to do the same budgets and increase 10%. That's not what transformational boards do. They really try to move towards the resources. And now when sustainability is so defining and actually even a platform for innovation, one of the things boards needs to do in that alignment is actually aligning with other stakeholders, not the least the shareholders. And with that, actually be able to tell the story to the shareholders so that they understand and want to continue to be part of that journey. Right. So it's those 3 things: sensing, pivoting, and aligning. And you can say that the pivoting is then part of the strategy and focus on the strategy, but that comes down much more to the operational way that the board works. And a very easy thing that I'm trying to push in my boards is that when we have a board meeting, which have historically started with reporting on the situation and the financials, i.e. looking backwards. If it's smaller companies, I even move it out of the board meetings and have it in separate meetings. And if it's larger boards, I'm trying to get it to be later in the agenda, just so that you start with the more strategic topics or the more hard to understand and agree to topics, which sounds like a no-brainer when you hear it, but it's not always done.
That's super interesting, because in order to come up with a really great strategy, I would imagine that the board needs to be quite close to the company, do a lot of homework in terms of knowing the complexities of a company and its industry, like you said before. How do we help boards to be more informed?
I think that to get the entire board to work on the correct things, the chairman is so instrumental. So the chair is really the person who guides what's really going to be debated on the meetings. So you'll have to influence the chair if you haven't done that to start with. I don't mind that people sit on a number of boards. I actually think it's quite good, because I know that will keep them in the market and they will pick up things from other boards that will be useful for the boards where I work with them. So I think it's quite good. I think it's actually better to have it like that than to have too many people who work operationally, because they will have to find different ways to prioritize. Again, a mixture is the best, of course, but in order to keep yourself updated, I think you have to continue to follow a lot of different development trends, blogs, insight guides. One of the things I'm trying to push in my boards is that we have a customer coming in at every other board meeting, and specifically ask them not to talk too much about our relationship, but to tell us how they look at their market and where they're heading and what challenges they see in the market. which I think is a fantastic way to shortcut in and get a lot of information and actually get a lot of good relationships with a lot of senior people on the customer side. So I think there's a number of good things that boards can do. I think the other thing boards can do is to ask the CEO to see if they can pick up a number of top talent to work on strategic agenda points and actually have them work through some things and come and present it. And of course, prepare them with, it's not necessarily so that we will pick suggestions that you come with, but we want to understand what you see in this strategic issue.
For an average large corporate, how well are they in terms of being a transformational board? Do they have the capacity to be a transformation board?
I think they have the capacity. I'm not sure they have the competence to do it, or the structure, I would say.
Right.
And I think one of the challenges is that board work is very regulated. So you have to define exactly how many meetings you're going to have, what you're going to have on the meetings. In most jurisdictions, this is regulated. Now, of course, you find ways to move out of that, but it's also regulated which committees you should have, what they should do, and how often they should meet. And I think you need to be doing what's needed, not necessarily in the structure that it was defined. And I think that is where some of the challenge sit. I think the other challenge is, of course, also time. I mean, you're trying to discuss and get through a lot of complex areas. And if you sit in financial institutions, you're furthermore regulated to go through a lot of risk items, which takes an enormous amount of time. And that's the reason also where the number of committees are growing as well. One of the things, though, that is interesting based on research is that the transformational boards, it doesn't really matter in what jurisdiction they are or in what structure they are. They tend to do the right things anyway.
Okay.
Which tells me that it's very much up to the chair to get things done together with the board in the way that it needs to be done.
I think you touched on this one before. So this is about the soft side of being an effective board. How can teams go about building trust and respect in the boardroom? And how can we encourage an environment where the board and management team can constructively challenge each other?
So it's interesting how we kind of fermented ourselves into a structure where boards are there to check and not there to guide. So one of the things that I do together with CEOs is to say, before we start each topic, and even also when you send out the material, let us know first, what is the purpose? What are you trying to get out? But even if it's just for information, add 1 or 2 questions you would like to put out as something that we need to think about. And if you get those 2 questions, if you get that framing when you both look at the material and you get into a discussion, it opens up so the CEO doesn't have to stand there and defend everything. It opens up much more towards, this is what's happening in this division or in this business area or in this initiative. And here are 2 things that we might think it's going to be hard, maybe we thought wrong or something, and actually inviting everybody to contribute to those challenges instead. And I think we all aim towards the same thing. And if we can get into that mindset, it's going to be easier to have those discussions and probably quicker to pick up some of the challenges that is always there in business in different areas.
Just saying there's a clear way forward, but perhaps there's maybe doubts with the management team or the key talents within the organization to actually carry out a strategic plan. How would you go about making decisions in that environment?
So, I mean, it depends a bit on what we're talking about, but Firstly, usually in most boards, you have a situation where you try to identify, pick up a new strategy, and you're going to reorganize for that strategy, and you're going to have people take on either new roles or new people taking on roles. I think it's super good to get a second opinion on that to help both the CEO and the board. So that's for the top management team. I do the same things when I have a discussion about succession. I ask the CEO and 2 levels down to all identify 3 people that can take on their job, and how quickly can they take on their job. And it's not necessarily so that their job will be there, but that means that everybody is engaged in both doing their job, but trying to lift more people into leadership capacities. So I think that area is super important. If it goes into areas where you're losing out so badly in the market that you need to make layoffs, for instance, then of course, in most large companies, you are unionized, you have to have discussions with unions. In Nordic, where I sit, where most of my boards are, we have the employees on the boards. So we have a way to get their input before we start to negotiate on that, which is actually very good. It makes us see things sometimes differently. But if it comes to that you actually need to make that change, well, you have to look at, are there other things we can show them, or how can we make the change as quick and as good for all parties as possible? Sometimes you even have to put a company into bankruptcy, and then you have to be prepared to take really uncomfortable decisions. But you have to try to do it in, we're doing this because we don't want the whole boat to sink. So you have to be daring then to take that. And it doesn't mean that you don't think of people. You actually do think of people. You think of the people that will survive in the company. The other thing I should mention is that when I ask for the succession and I ask for 3 people, I always ask to have at least one of the other sex, usually female. And I very often get the answer, there are none. Well, then just find one and say that the transition into your job is 10 years or 15 years, but there must be some you can train up. And when you do that, everybody gets to think a bit differently. And then as soon as people have started to think about somebody, they also start to take care of them a bit more, so that people are getting more trained for higher positions and tougher positions.
And that touches on diversity in leadership, right? Have you seen much transformation yourself in the boardroom or in the C-suite over time?
Absolutely. And obviously the number speaks for itself. And obviously one reason has been that a lot of the females that have gotten to the top of the companies have been more in supporting roles than in the business owning roles. Why I always recommend women to try to stay close to the customer. It gives you power. But one of the things that I can see is, of course, changing is when you get the diversity, and the diversity is both on gender, but it's actually also on culture. Where do you come from? What is your experiences? Age. So it's also a bit of diversity in broader perspectives. And that means that you, as a board, have more insights to take from. However, you don't get to a unanimous decision that quickly. So you have to find the balance in that. But I have a super nice story to tell, which happened just in May this year. And I've been on an infrastructure board for, I think, 4 years, 3-4 years. And I have been the only female for all of those years and been pushing to get transformation done. And when we changed a lot, we switched chairmen, we changed a couple of board members, and we were looking for board members, I was imminent to say it has to be at least one more woman this time. And the fantastic thing is we got more women. So in that board, we are now 60% women.
Oh, wow.
Which almost blew people away.
Wow.
And they're super good. On the AGM, they shared with the shareholders their experiences. I think everybody was just blown away.
Mm-hmm. Why is it so important to actually change the culture of the board? Why is that important?
It broadens your perspectives, right? And you're trying to take decisions that partly impact different customer sets, so you might be able to better reflect them. But it's also just based on the innovation side, you have more perspectives to draw from. I think the only thing I'd be a bit cautious about is to take on too many specialists into the board. I think people need to have run businesses. And that is because the decisions around one specialty only happens maybe once a year. But the other 10 times you need to take decisions on things you have to understand, right? So I think in that sense, it's important to have run a business, to understand the complexities of a business.
It seems like even though there are more and more, say, diversity on the board, you were there from the get-go, very, very early on. And, you sitting there by yourself as being the first female in many boards. Can I just ask you, why do you think you found yourself as the first of many?
I think that's a super good question, but I think it starts out and comes from two things. I mean, one of the things is I'm in sectors or areas where there are less women, right? So obviously somebody has to come first. And then the other thing is I like to make impact. I like to change things. I like to make things become better. And because of that, I have put myself not just on the board side, but in my entire career, I've tried to take on assignments that makes businesses grow and myself grow. And when you do that, obviously, you learn things that can add value to other things.
Have you always been like that?
I think things have made me take different corners to move forward. I had a really tough situation when I ended university. So I was really interested in sustainability, which at that time, the only education that was there was civil engineering. So I went into civil engineering, and my mom and dad, I mean, they are in healthcare. So it was really odd for me to end up there, but it was more based on this interest of sustainability. And then you kind of just try to figure out and learn all of these other things that you need to learn. When we came to an end of that education, the industry representatives came in, and we were 6 girls out of a class of 157.
Wow.
And they told us, the girls, that there was no point for us to actually apply for jobs because they didn't want to have girls. And I was so shocked, and I was so sad, and I was so furious. I had spent almost 5 years getting a master's in super complex things, and they weren't even interested in trying me out. And I was so furious about this. But that made me think, these idiots don't understand anything. So I wrote a letter to NASA and asked them for a job. And I told them what I knew. And I got the job at NASA, which was really odd. I would never have done that otherwise, right? So I got a job in that. And that actually defined a lot of things for me in my career, because there I used computers to calculate flows of water.
Right.
And at the time, I didn't even think of computers as anything else than calculators, if you think, advanced calculators. But that eventually made people find me because I knew computing things and actually switch into another industry. So with all of that story, have I always been like that? Not necessarily, but when I bump into things which is really tough, I try something else. And usually you can't see it at the time, but something will help you go forward, maybe in another direction you didn't think of.
That's amazing. When you got that NASA letter to say, yes, you got the job, did you go, yes, I knew I could do it?
I think when I wrote it, I was so upset. I don't think I thought I would ever get it, actually.
Wow.
And then when I got it, it became very practical. How would I do this? And how do I travel? Will I understand what they're saying? And will I be able to do that? I mean, you get into very practical things directly. So I think it's more later on that I can see that some of these things that happens, when you're in it, it isn't necessarily so that you think that it's a good thing. It's a really bad thing. But after a while, I can now see it gave me a totally different career. That has been very good for me. And maybe from the beginning should have been a better area for me to be in than the area I first worked and was educated for.
It's quite amazing. It seems like the consistent thing, though, it is about sustainability and environment, because so much of your work today has to do with the SDGs, and now you can actually affect so many different companies with being on the board.
I think if I look at it myself, I think it was a lot of sustainability in the beginning, and then I thought more of it as business. I think the area around people was always there. I think the area around environment wasn't there that strong. I think that has come back very much now. And obviously with the climate change that we have in front of us. I think we all can look back at our histories and think, why didn't I think more about environment in all of the things I could have done there? But that's no point. We can do it now. And that will need innovation, super amount of innovation. And I think the interesting thing about the innovation that is needed now is that it will not stay within the boundaries of the company. The companies will have to collaborate across supply chains in order to actually make the innovation that is needed. I saw research just the other day that had identified that 80% of the carbon emission is in scope 3, which basically means nobody takes care of it, right? Or it basically means it's somebody else's fault. It's not mine. And that's, I think, why it's super important that we look across the value chain, not just within our boundaries, because then we will still be hit with the problem of the 80% if we haven't looked across the value chain. And it's also a fantastic base for innovation. I think I mentioned to you one of the boards that I think have done really well is IKEA. And I think what they've done is they have truly looked at the broader landscape of ESG, but also the broader landscape of their supply chain, both offerings and their sourcing. And in terms of that, they have, if you look at their business strategy, a solid part of their business strategy is circularity. And another super interesting area is that they're adding another industry, which is energy. So they're going into the energy industry and they're selling solar panels and they're selling energy subscriptions and they have started to buy solar parks. And I think that is very obvious when you're starting to do it. But before you looked across a broader part of the value chain, you won't see it. And I usually say, for instance, for tech companies, a lot of the tech companies, which is primarily a services or software side, their biggest impact is usually in the offerings. It's not what they're doing within their own boundaries. So they need to be super good in developing interesting and transformative offerings.
Yeah, that's right. So for those people who don't understand the 1, 2, 3, scale of impacts. Would you mind just going through it?
Yeah, sure. Yes, absolutely. And I got caught because I know you know it. But the scope 1 is really around what you are doing in your own business. Scope 2 is the energy you need to work with your own business. And scope 3 is really around what are you using to actually produce or work with the things you're doing, and what are you delivering to, and how are you impacting your customers. So it's obvious when you hear it, but most people start with scope 1 and 2, which I think is fair to start to get some sense of where you are. But for board levels and thinking about the long term and the strategy, we very quickly need to look at the broader perspective, not just the company in itself.
And that connects right back to responsible innovation as well. That's why we had such a good chat last time, because responsible innovation is about looking at the broader impact of what a company does and looking at not just, say, the environment only, but also impact on human well-being, economic sustainability. So it's super interesting to hear you talk about all this stuff. And we are instilling a new tradition with our interview program where we ask each of our interviewees 3 questions. So the first question I would like to ask you is, tell us a story only you can tell. And the second question is, teach us a lesson only you can teach. And you can blend them if you want to.
Right. And I'm thinking that the story only I can tell, I probably already told when I told you the story of actually going through the challenge around when you meet the challenge, go around it. But if I take the other perspective of telling a story, I think that it's not just something I can tell, but I'm super focused on trying to pick up and learn things and try to make that as part of a habit. And when I was in my operational job, I always had pet projects. And pet projects means it's not necessarily so that we need to have it. It's something that I think is good. In some way, it contributes to some things, but it's also inspiring. And one of the things I did when I worked for the Indian company is I put up a mentor program between my top leaders and the principals of the high schools in Stockholm. So it was between a lot of Indian leaders and a lot of the school principals and teachers. And one of the reasons I did it was I thought the school was getting hammered so badly because they didn't do the right things. So I wanted them to get a broader perspective. And I also wanted my leadership team to get a better connecting to the society. And that took off on its own in a fantastic way. So a lot of these people still are in Connect. They sent classes from Stockholm to India to teach Indian school children about circularity and taking care of garbage. It took on an entirely different thing that I'm super happy about, but it wasn't by design happening like that. It was because I put together good people to make a difference, and I gave them the room to make a difference. And I think that is something that you can think about in a lot of settings. Give people a bit of leash, give them a view and perspective of what you want to have out of it, and you will usually get more than what you thought you would.
And to conclude, our last question, and it is about your vision for the future.
Right.
And the question is, in Vision 2050, what would you hope it to look like, feel like, and sound like?
Right. So I think in 2050, we have learned that we are not each other's enemy. And we have learned that through the horrible things going on now in geopolitics, and we have learned it through getting another joint enemy, and that is the climate that we need to take care of. So we have learned and found that by collaborating, we will actually get much more abundance, all of us. And in combination with finding ways to use digital, we will all have moved into really meaningful jobs and meaningful occupations, whether we have jobs or not, but meaningful occupations. And I'd be 90 at the time, so I'm planning to sit and enjoy a lot of my children and grandchildren, and staying connected to a lot of my international friends, including you, through digital. And it will be like we're sitting next to each other.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm really looking forward to 2050.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if I can actually add another thing, because this is one song that has inspired me for so many years, and you will know it, but I'll just take a short quote out of that song, and it's the song from Louis Armstrong, and he says, "I see friends shaking hands saying, 'How do you do?' They're really saying, 'I love you.' I hear babies crying, I watch them grow. They learn much more than I'll never know. And I think of myself, what a wonderful world."
Beautiful.
It is very nice.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. Last time when we had a chat, I was like, I'm really looking forward to the full interview. And I feel like we could actually go and talk for another 2 hours or something like that. So thank you so much for your time. I know you have another meeting coming.
Thank you so much. And you and I connect back later on. Fantastic work and super nice to talk to you.
I hear babies cry. I watch them grow. They learn much more than I never knew. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world.